Good afternoon, everybody. It is Friday, October the 9th, 2020. We are 25 days away from the November 3rd general election. My name's Keir Murray, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston. We're convening our weekly meeting to talk about all things political, and shockingly, there's nothing to talk about, right? I think when we spoke a week ago, President Trump had been newly diagnosed with the COVID virus, and then I think soon after we completed our session, rather dramatically was transported to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, where he spent a few days. I believe now is since back at the White House and has recorded some some videos for public consumption, but I don't think has been seen in public since. We've also had a vice presidential debate and just a number of fast-moving developments as it relates to COVID-19 and an outbreak in the White House with 20 or so people from the president and first lady on down who have been infected by the virus. And not surprisingly, this seems to have had a pretty dramatic impact on at least the coverage and state of the presidential race. And so I wanted to lead off with that. How do you think the president's COVID diagnosis and his public conduct or lack of public conduct since contracting it has affected the race?
I think quite profoundly. We've had a lot of things happen that didn't seem to make much difference. That Biden had established this lead 4 or 5 months ago of 5, 6, 7 points, and that seemed to be pretty darn stable. But pretty clearly, virtually all indicators now are that lead has widened quite significantly to 10, 12, maybe even 14 points. And you're seeing all the indications from internal Republican polling of a panic, that they feel they're in a free fall in many of these races around the country. I should also want to remind our voters that this is not theoretical at this point. According to Michael McDonald's website at the University of Florida, the United States Election Project, over 8 million votes had been cast mostly by mail or absentee ballot and returned. More astounding number to me, in the states that have party registration, 50 million people have requested absentee ballots. 22 million of those are from registered Democrats, 13 million from registered Republicans, 15 million from persons with no party identity. So we're really, next week coming up, when we start opening early voting in other states, we're really going to be in the midst of the election next week, with probably 2 million votes a day being returned, maybe even 3 million. So the old notion of, October surprise, something happens in the last few days, we're entering the real election right now.
And I think, yeah, that's true. And I want to focus on an aspect of the COVID-19 outbreak at the White House. And that's, I think, for lack of a better term, just a lack of transparency coming from the White House about what's actually going on with the president's health, and to a lesser degree with people in his orbit at the White House and their health. My own sense is that sort of lack of transparency, not making it clear or being cagey about what's actually going on, is further damaging the president politically and reinforcing, I think, a sort of pre-existing or underlying current among the electorate that the management of the COVID-19 crisis writ large has not been well executed by the administration, and their seeming lack of footing with regards to the outbreak in the White House itself, I believe, reinforces that political problem for the president. What's your sense of that?
I agree. I would also like to note a couple of things. We're just getting some studies now completed about the after effects of getting the virus, particularly for persons who, as the president said, was really sick, in his own words. About 30% of people that have a pretty severe case suffer some significant psychological aspects. And I think the president looks like, to me, more and more, he's in that 30%. A couple of things that I found quite astounding. Sure, he's blasting Barack Obama and Joe Biden again, calling Kamala Harris a communist and so forth. but to turn and attack your two perhaps most loyal and significant cabinet members, your Attorney General Bob Barr and Pompeo, for not doing enough to investigate and indict. This is nutso stuff. On top of the incredible erratic behavior on this really important measure for the country of getting some kind of stimulus bill done, is, millions of people are literally facing evictions and can't pay their bills, can't buy groceries, and he's been all over the map. It's you got to check in every 15 minutes to see what the administration's position is. So this is not normal behavior, and it just seems to be the pretty good likelihood that the president has been, affected psychologically as well as physically by this virus.
I've read some commentary from some medical experts, given the cocktail of medications that the White House has said he's been taking, some of which he's very vocally talked about himself, that at least one or two of those can potentially have short-term psychological and mental effects. And there's been some speculation that could be medication that's prompting a series of 40 tweets in the span of an hour that are all over the map. I guess I concur with you. I think that the developments of the last week or so have further weakened the president's reelection prospects. How do you think he emerges from this, or can he emerge? How can he turn this around with now about 3.5 weeks to go?
He's trying some Hail Mary moves, like apparently very recently he's now talking about a new stimulus which looks like they're edging somewhat toward Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, but he just has no credibility. I mean, even people on his side know you can't rely on him, and that makes it extremely difficult to make meaningful deals, because the ghost written art of the deal president can't make a deal, it seems, because he's too utterly unreliable, and it's maddening. But it's dropping the congressional Republicans in the grease big time, as people like Ted Cruz are beginning to note. This is really, really serious. And they don't have the option, seems to me, that existed in 1996. I've been around for a few of these rodeos. Pretty clearly, by about 3 weeks out, Bill Clinton was going to beat Bob Dole. And the congressional Republicans basically acknowledged that and said, look, Clinton's going to get reelected. You got to return us, or we'll be a check on this Democratic president. Dole was furious. Well, Republicans that are running for office cannot separate themselves from this president, because he'll turn the Twitter fire hose on them, and then they're dead for sure. What can happen, though, is the donors, and it looks like to me that's what's going on right now, that the big donors are increasingly saying, Trump's a goner. Let's switch our focus not to the House also looks going, to try to save the Republican Senate. So it seems to me that's where to the extent that there's cash to be raised, and Republicans need cash, they're being outspent across the board. The Senate Republicans will likely be the beneficiary of that kind of recognition that this is the best place left to invest.
Let's talk about the Senate. I think, as we've said, in order for control of the Senate to change hands, the Democrats would need to net 3 seats in this election. I think most observers believe they will lose the seat in Alabama that Doug Jones won in a special election. It's a very difficult state for Democrats to compete in. So then moves the number to needing to win 4 additional to that. A lot of focus has been, of course, on Susan Collins in Maine, Martha McSally in Arizona, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, as well as some others. We did see some developments over the last week in the North Carolina race, some personal conduct issues for the Democratic challenger there, extramarital activities. In a race where Cal Cunningham, the Democrat, looked like he had a pretty solid lead over Tillis. What's your sense of if and how those revelations might affect that race in North Carolina?
Yeah, well, about 800,000 votes have already been cast. So, that's probably about 20% of the vote, and about 75 or 80% left to go. These are pretty explosive charges that look like they have some real substance. Uh, Cunningham has been extraordinarily fortunate, and he's already raised a ton of money, so he's not so dependent down the stretch on extra financing. And that the huge story out of the White House and the president is obviously sucked some of the oxygen out of the room. So I think he's probably got a decent chance of surviving, not being on the ground there. It's hurt him. But this may be one of those elections where, just about everybody's locked in, and they're locked in for the president and his team, or they're locked in to vote him out. You've got other developments, I think, that are significant, particularly in the upper Midwest with this right-wing militia apparent real plot to kidnap the governor, have her tried in some kangaroo court. And this is blown up again for the president in an absolutely terrible moment. Michigan is a vital state, 16 electoral votes. Trump has been trailing in all the state polls. And this can't be helpful because the president has been so frequently critical of the governor. And, this is not a development that is likely to improve the Trump force in Michigan or the neighboring state of Wisconsin, which is also a very, very close pivotal state.
And that's where they were going to have the trial, right? If I read correctly,
right.
They were to take Governor Whitmer from Michigan to Wisconsin and try her for treason. Yeah, and I thought, again, I don't understand why the response from the president on Twitter is to attack Governor Whitmer yesterday rather than express sympathy for, the threat on her life. Let's talk about some of these other races that for the Senate that may be also in play and where those might stand. I know Joni Ernst in Iowa, the freshman incumbent there, is now facing a surprisingly strong challenge from Teresa Greenfield. We have 2 seats in Georgia, one a special election to fill a retiring senator's seat, and another that's on the ballot that could potentially be in play there. Lindsey Graham in South Carolina is facing a much more difficult reelection prospect than he thought. And then you can add states like Kansas and Alaska and even Texas, where developments seem to indicate that those races are tightening and that the Republican incumbents are not, or in Kansas's case, it's an open seat, but that the Republicans are not assured of winning what would normally be considered comfortable states for them for these Senate races. What do you think about the prospect for some of these second tier races moving up on the list?
I think given what looks to me like the wheels coming off the Trump campaign, money, momentum, the pattern we're seeing in early voting, Democrats are requesting ballots and sending them back in, and Republicans are much slower at doing this. I think the Democratic potential now is worst case gaining 2 or 3 seats and basically having a Senate that's about tied, and probably the vice president would be breaking the tie. Or Democrats pick up 8 to 10 seats.
Wow, that many.
When one of these swing states tends to come into play, it usually brings several others. The president's a national story. What's happening nationally, it seems to me, is happening in many, many states. And therefore, the risk is, as I think Ted Cruz was saying in most recent comments, this could be a bloodbath. And so we'll watch the voting patterns with interest next week and the following week, because I think by then we'll have half the entire vote in the country cast.
Yeah, obviously, and we'll get to Texas momentarily, where our voting begins Tuesday, October the 13th, thanks to the Texas Supreme Court upholding that extension of early voting that had been challenged by conservative activists against Governor Greg Abbott. But what about the prospects for, you mentioned this at the outset, what about a COVID-19 bill before the election? There's been some back and forth with this on the amount. Nancy Pelosi proposing $2.5 trillion. Steve Mnuchin, the president's advisor, coming back with closer to $1.5. Can they meet in the middle before the election? And then the idea that the Republicans in the Senate are prioritizing the confirmation to the Supreme Court of Amy Coney Barrett over a new stimulus bill for coronavirus relief. How do you think those politics play out with regard to legislation before the election?
Well, in a kind of rational political actor world, you would think an embattled Republican president would sure as hell make a deal with Nancy Pelosi to get a real bill passed. At least it's going to be hard to get any money to anybody before November 3rd, but at least you could say it's coming. But I think Pelosi's minimum price is you've got to put significant money in for state and local governments. And that's a real sticking point with Mitch McConnell and the Republican senators. McConnell can only pass the bill in the Senate with Democratic votes. It's pretty clear that there's a significant block of Republicans that are not going to vote for anything that Pelosi can accept. And of course, Mitch is very reluctant to do that. That's because, again, his number one priority is the Supreme Court confirmation. They get all tangled up. The schedule is still apparently somewhat intact to start the virtual hearings next week, but they don't have much wiggle room here. And if you get no confirmation before November 3rd and the election is a blowout and a whole bunch of Republicans lose, then you're not in a great position in the lame duck session, which truly would be lame duck, to push through a nominee that, to the extent the public's vote was partially conditioned upon the Supreme Court situation, they were saying in the election, no, don't do it.
Yeah, and I think, adding to, as we know, at least a couple of Republican senators have contracted coronavirus. Some think that the coming out party for Judge Barrett for her, announcement as being the nominee for the Supreme Court seat ended up being a super spreader event that infected, among others, a couple of Republican senators, including Mike Lee of Utah and others, but who sits on the Judiciary Committee. But do you think those hearings go forward? I mean, I know McConnell, as you said, has made this a top priority for him. Does he press on with this health crisis going on, or do they tap the brakes on that?
I think in the near term, McConnell has to keep going forward, because to pull back would be very deflating to the evangelical voters, and that's the largest part of the Republican base. And that base is not large enough to win, but if they start losing interest in the election and staying home, then you're talking about a huge landslide. And so Mitch is a wily operator, particularly within the confines of the Senate. But his public image broadly, but maybe not as bad in Kentucky, but he's not in great shape there, is that he's one of the least liked people in American politics. And so I don't know what he does. He will calculate all the angles. I mean, if his own seat was not up, that might be some factor, but it is. And he has a very well-funded, although underdog opponent running against him, Ms. McGrath in Kentucky. But I'm just fascinated at the extraordinary fast pace of events. And you have what to me is increasingly a fundamental unstable player, the President of the United States, right in the middle of it.
Yeah, two things before we leave the national scene. One is, do you think the other two debates will happen, scheduled presidential debates? And I do, yeah.
Well, again, I think, the Biden camp is in a much stronger position, certainly to insist that they're not debating Trump face to face until he tests negative. And, so far as we know, nothing like that has yet occurred. Biden has been able to sort of take the high ground in this. I'm ready to debate. I want to stick with the schedule of the debate commission. If it's virtual, I'm happy. If we can do something later after the president tests negative. My guess is we'll probably get one more debate in. Not on the 15th, pretty obviously, but maybe on the 22nd. The Biden camp, I think, will want to hold out for a town hall meeting, because that's likely a format that the president, given his erratic behavior these days and tendency to bristle at questions that are not, and he sees it fair, that he just can't afford to be attacking ordinary voters the way he does his political opponents. So I think Biden, is in again, a strong position here. No in-person debating until the president tests negative, and try to hold to this town hall format if possible.
And that brings us to the vice presidential debate, which occurred a couple of days ago between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. What was your take on how that event came off?
Well, I think it's pretty important because as we a lot of people have said we're probably good chance we're looking at the 47th president of the United States. And one of these two people, one way or the other, has a pretty good shot at ending up in the big job. I think it fell into the broad category of most vice presidential debates. That is, nothing really changed. Every now and then something does in a vice presidential debate, but not very often. And that's to Biden's benefit. He doesn't need things to change. He needs things to keep going in the same direction. Harris and Pence are traditional American politicians in the way that Donald Trump is not. They're both pretty wily operators. Pence particularly, was a talk show host before getting into elective politics, and he just didn't answer the questions that he didn't want to take up. And Harris slid off, of course, the Supreme Court expansion. So it wasn't a particularly informative debate, except to get the style and manner. I think Harris probably helped herself in terms of her long-term political future. But the race, I think, is effectively where it was before. A lot more money poured in on the Democratic side, but that's the least of their worries these days. They're just raising more money via these smaller donations than anybody's ever seen.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with you. My sense is that, both players in that debate had some good moments where they got in some good shots at the other and made some good points. I thought it was Senator Harris took the opportunity to introduce herself, and one of the questions she sort of skirted it and ended up talking about her bio to some extent, which I think was smart, because my guess is to average American viewers, she's not particularly well known to a lot of them yet. And I thought that worked to her benefit. Again, I thought Pence had some good moments, particularly pressing the case on the economy and some other matters. His one mistake, I thought, was interrupting her. And that was a trap, my guess, that the Harris team set for him, and he walked right into it. Which gave them a zinger for the night. But I agree with you. In general, I don't think the debate changed anything. Let's shift to Texas. We've seen probably a half dozen polls or so in the last 48 hours, most of which show the race effectively tied for president in the state, which is something that we've talked about often when we've had these sessions. That doesn't seem to have changed. We do have word that the Biden camp has decided to invest several $1 million in television and other things down the stretch. Some other national groups are following suit. Where do you think we sit with voting about to begin in Texas next week?
I think Trump's in real danger of losing the state. I think that the polling models are probably predicated on the traditional rather low presidential turnout that Texas has exhibited for years. If we're not the next to last state, we're usually in the bottom 5. And I think that will probably change this year. I think we're going to see, we had about 9 million votes cast in 2016. And I think we'll go way over 10 million and approaching 11 million. And at that level of turnout, if it happens, and that's an if, but we'll get some ideas that once we start seeing the pattern of voting, then I think the Democrats will have the edge in the presidential race. But, other down ballot Republicans may well be able to run ahead of the president. If they don't, a lot of them are in real trouble. And that's including the senator, John Cornyn, and at least 7 or 8 House members and 20 or 25 state legislators.
Some Supreme Court justices and a couple of other.
And of course, within our state, the pretty explosive charges against one of the 2 most prominent Tea Party leader conservative Republicans, Dan Patrick being the other, the lieutenant governor, but the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, who is, I believe, the co-chair of the Trump campaign in Texas, but now has not a bunch of deep state secret Democrats, but a bunch of really conservative Christian credentialed people that worked in his own office, basically saying something rotten's going on over here and we're not taking the fall, and basically calling for an investigation of the Attorney General's office, including his number 1 deputy, I guess Patir. And again, these people have impeccable Republican conservative credentials, but they're also ambitious people who don't want to see their careers blown up in a corrupt office.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting that how that potential scandal sort of colors the overall race in Texas down the stretch. I'm also been struck by the degree of acrimony within the Republican ranks statewide. For example, we have the fairly new state Republican chair, Alan West, the former Florida congressman who relocated to Texas several years ago and was elected chairman of the Republican Party earlier this year, has been a pretty persistent thorn in Governor Abbott's side over the last several months, particularly with regard to coronavirus response. Feeling that the governor not opening everything completely is a tyrant and, draconian in his rule, to the degree to which he and some other conservatives, I believe, will be protesting outside the governor's mansion this weekend. And I'm thinking to myself, normally if you're the chair of a state party, your job is to go after the other guys in the other party, not the people on your own side. So, I mean, what does this suggest to you about what's happening within the Republican Party in Texas when they're on the precipice of, I think everyone would say, the most competitive general election they've had to face in Texas in a very long time?
Yeah, and I think they reflect the fact that just almost no Republicans have any experience with being in a competitive state. This Empower Texas folks, with a couple of Texas very conservative billionaires funding, have been going after the remaining kind of old George W. Bush moderate Republicans, pretty much all of whom are out of office now. Like Speaker Strauss quit. So Abbott now, who was a pretty conservative guy, has sort of moved into that position of being the quote moderate Republican, and he's their target. You're ignoring the growing Democratic threat, partly because, of course, we haven't elected a Democrat statewide since 1994, but we're probably about to start electing some. And frequently, when you have this kind of rapid political change, it comes much quicker than many people, especially that are part of the longtime winning coalition, realize that things can collapse in a hurry. And I think that the Republicans, by focusing on their internal disagreements, and now Abbott right in the middle of it, are kind of creating an opportunity for the Democrats to move forward without having to deal with the energized, united Republican Party.
Yeah, and one of the things we've known over the last several years is Governor Abbott has been, uh, by a wide margin, the most popular statewide elected Republican in the state. He has consistently polled in the mid to upper 50s in terms of job approval, and in every poll that I had seen up until a few months ago, even attracted favorability from a significant chunk of Democrats, 20, 25, even 30% in some polls that I've seen. But one of the polls I looked at this week, and the most interesting thing I saw in the crosstabs, was that the governor's favorability with the general election electorate had dropped under 40%. He was now at 39% approval and 51% disapproval rate, a really remarkable drop from just a few months ago. No doubt, in part or mostly probably due to the effects of the COVID-19 virus on the economy and his leadership on that issue. But what we've seen in past elections is the governor able to sort of lead the charge for the statewide Republican effort as the standard bearer for that effort. But if his political condition has weakened to that degree, other than writing checks, which he has a pretty good ability to do you think that diminishes his ability to sort of lead the ticket in the state? Obviously, Trump's leading it nationally, but to be it for, especially when I'm thinking about these state house races around the state where he's really weighed in the past. Can he do that now? And if he can't, who does on their side?
Well, I just think it's awfully tough with an incredibly center of attention president who insists, even very often when it's not to his advantage to be at the center of attention, on being so. Cornyn has never been a high visibility or particularly popular senator. We have too many House members. Most people don't know much about any of these, including their own member in a lot of cases. Yeah, so on paper, the governor would be the guy leading the charge, but he's somewhat engaged with issues within his own party. He has a lot of money in his political account. governors can take unlimited contributions, and he's been in office now for whatever 5 years. But and money that down the stretch makes some difference. But it looks like to me Trump's driving turnout in Texas very high, and that hurts down ballot Republicans.
So what I want to talk about COVID in the state of Texas, because, I think most people would say our cases had leveled off and declined pretty substantially over the last few months. There are some indications recently that they're going back up. Hospitalizations are starting to go back up, not uniformly across the state, but I know in Dallas County and some other places, they're worried about resurgence. As we saw a couple of days ago, the governor issued an order saying, well, bars can reopen if your county judge says it's okay, which I thought was an interesting departure from his usual disdain for local control, which suggests to me he doesn't want to be on the hook for these decisions locally. But how do you think a resurgence or a potential resurgence in COVID as we head into voting may or may not have an impact on turnout and on the mechanism by which people vote? And it's important, for example, that courts have ruled, for example, in Harris County, for example, where the clerk was prepared to send a mail ballot to every registered voter, that he is not permitted to do that. How do you see this playing out with the mechanism for voting, what people are allowed to do, and the sort of how COVID is going to affect directly the participation?
Well, it's a great question, and that's the single biggest issue about overall turnout. Because of the virus, maybe turnout is not as I think it will be very high. It might be just moderate. The one pandemic we had in the 20th century was a midterm election, but turnout dropped 10% in that election in 1918. It was a disaster for the Democrats that year. Woodrow Wilson was the president. He wasn't on the ballot, but Democrats lost control of Congress and didn't regain it for over a decade. But I think most people in Texas, since that we're not in the middle of a raging hyper spread environment, that I think will lead to a lot of people doing the usual and voting early in person. We're sure going to see a lot more mail ballots because usually that's a pretty low percentage. But we're probably still going to mostly vote in this October 13, October 30th in-person window, where most of the big urban counties with Democrats running the elections have opened up a lot more polling stations and extended the hours. So I think we'll have a robust turnout before Election Day, but that's one of the things I'm going to be monitoring as we start getting the actual hard data next week.
Yeah, and as we've talked about before, I mean, what do you think higher turnout does to projections about who's likely to benefit, both statewide and locally?
Well, we sure know that the historic low turnout has helped Republicans over the last 20 years. I mean, they've won every statewide election. And that turnout means that in a presidential year, you can win with 4.5 million votes because, if there's only 9 million total votes, anything north of 4.5 million means you're ahead. But when you get over 10 million and when you get toward 11 million, 4.5 million are not enough. And going from 4.5 to 5.5 million, I don't know if the Republicans can do that in this kind of climate. So I think it's quite risky. Anything above 11 million total, I think the state Republican Party is in big, big trouble. By point of reference, there are about 16.7 million persons registered right now. That's up about 1.6 million from 4 years ago, when it was about 15.1 or 15.2 when Clinton and Trump faced off. Because there's been virtually no Anglo growth in Texas net. Virtually all of those additional voters are persons of color. Latinos, more Asians, some more blacks. And, if they're voting at higher levels, it just makes it a lot more difficult. And the number to watch is the most recent highly contested election, Ted Cruz for senator against Beto O'Rourke. The margin was about 2.6 points, or a little over 200,000 votes difference. About 8.4 million people voting. Cruz prevailed by 200,000 plus. Well, I think just here in Harris County, Cruz lost the county by about 205,000 votes. I think Trump loses it by more than 300,000. That's half the entire statewide margin that Cruz rolled up in this one county. I think there's trouble here.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to note is that I went back and looked at the two big polling averages, Real Clear Politics and 538. Nate Silver, as people know. I looked at the final averages for Texas in 2018, and my recollection was that Real Clear Politics had, on average, Cruz winning by about 7 points, and had 538 had Cruz winning by about 5. And so both of those models polling, Beto overperformed the polling averages of both of those pretty well regarded indexes. Those indexes now are about 1 point. About a 1 point lead for Donald Trump on average in the state of Texas, at least as of the last time I looked. So I think that especially as turnout goes up, the kind of modeled electorates that a lot of these polls use can be less reliable, right?
Yes. And one of the things we know, particularly with the presidential race in 2016, there weren't a hell of a lot of undecided voters at the last minute, but there were quite a few, particularly a lot of people didn't like either candidate. Trump got about 70% of those people who decided to vote how they were going to vote on election day. The truly undecided usually are kind of low information voters that haven't been paying a hell of a lot of attention, but they do decide worthwhile voting. They go to the polls. They rarely split 50-50. And I think with Trump being the most dominant figure in our politics for 5 years now, they're more likely to split against him than for him, particularly because we think there's more economic pain coming in our state and nationally because of the end of these stimulus programs that helped a lot of ordinary families. So I think, again, the polling averages, as in 2018, are probably going to overstate a likely level of Republican support.
Okay, and before we move on to our sort of last segment, I want to remind people that if you have a question you'd like us to address, just put it in the chat at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to get to some of those. Obviously, one of the big focuses in Texas in this election cycle has been control of the Texas House of Representatives, not least because of the potential impacts on redistricting, which is done after every census. As we know, we are still in the collection period for census data. There's been some dispute about that. The Trump administration wanted to end it, I believe, as of the beginning of this month. A federal judge, I think, blocked that, and it at least continues as of now, as scheduled through the end of this month, which was the original schedule. Let's talk about what control of the Texas House for either party might mean in terms of how new districts are drawn after the next census is certified. We know that Texas, because of its population gain, is likely to gain 2 or 3 new congressional seats, and the 150 state House and 31 state Senate seats in the legislature will have to be redrawn and balanced for population. So how do you foresee that process potentially playing out if the Republicans say retain narrow control of the Texas House, or if they lose it to the Democrats, which I think are the two most likely scenarios?
Well, the Republicans will likely have one structural asset in redrawing the legislature, that if the legislature fails to do so after the census numbers become available, then in the summer of 2021, this Texas Redistricting Board would shoulder that burden, and that's going to have a Republican majority, because you might well have a Democratic speaker that's on the board, but he would be outnumbered by the lieutenant governor and the attorney general and the land commissioner, and there's one other controller, I guess, the other 4 members. So Republicans may end up having more power over redistricting, even with a Democratic House, because they might just block any action, or governor might veto whatever they pass. But I've been working on redistricting in Texas all of my adult life. This is going to be a very challenging redistricting draw for the Republicans, particularly in the legislature, where you can't add any seats, because among other things, they're going to have to abolish 3 or 4 rural Republican seats and move them to these suburban areas that are much less reliably Republican, as we were going to see in Fort Bend and Williamson and Collin and Denton counties. The map they drew in 2011, a very cleverly drawn map, is in real danger of collapsing in this election. And all the trend lines are bad. 100 Republican rural counties losing people. Those districts all have to get bigger. And if you push them deeper into the suburbs, well, then you run into the problem of the remaining suburban Republicans don't want to give up a lot of what they've got left. For example, here, if in the 134, the congressional district in which we live, Sarah Davis is one of the endangered moderate Republicans. Even if she narrowly prevails, the only way you can save a seat around here is to merge the Republican parts of Murphy's district to the north, the 133rd, with the 134th. You can't save more than one Republican district here in the inner city. That's the max. So part of it is structurally, even if Republicans control the process, they can't do what they did in 2011 because of their losses of support among suburban voters.
And part of the problem also is that by law, you can't break county lines in the large counties. Like, for example, Harris County has vacillated between 24 and 25 state house seats. There's some possibility, we're at 24 now, there's some possibility we'll go back up to 25, but it'll be either one of those two numbers. And you can't go over into Montgomery or into Chambers or into Galveston or Fort Bend to get more voters. You have to stay within the boundaries and fill all those seats. Same is true in Dallas and Tarrant and the other Bear and the other big counties in the state, which I think also will present a challenge. What about congressional seats? If we get, let's say we get 3 new members of Congress, how does that affect the balance of representation and where those seats might go?
One of them has to go to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. One has to go to metropolitan Houston, and the third has to be somewhere in that corridor between San Antonio and Austin, I-35, because that's where all the growth has been. And you do have a little wiggle room in drawing state House and Senate seats. You can be a little over, a little under, plus or minus 5%. But in Congress, you have got to put the exact number on it. It was like 698,500 last time. This time around, it'll be about 735,000 or whatever. And every district has to be exactly equal in population. So you can be creative in crossing county lines, but you can't be creative in trying to fudge the numbers this way or that way. That's why keeping that census count open, pretty important. And that's why the Trump people were pushing hard to shut it down as rapidly as possible to make some of the harder to count populations not enumerated. That apparently did not work. It seems to me very much unlikely you can rush a count and deliver it before the end of the year. And then January, you're going to have the new Congress sworn in the first week, and that's where the census data goes to. And if you have Democratic majorities for sure in the House and likely in the Senate, you know, they have a lot of discretion once you're into the next legislative term. You know, they take office a couple of weeks before the new president.
Right. Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch. And again, I think, you know, the next legislative session, which we'll get to another time, has all kinds of reasons why it's going to be very, very challenging, not least because of serious budget problems brought on by COVID-19 and the slowdown in the oil and gas industry, which is going to cause a lot of challenges to deal with, as well as these fights over redistricting and expanding healthcare access and other things. It'll be fascinating to watch, but we can talk about that another time. I'm going to give people last call. If there's a question, if you want to put it in the chat, we will try to answer it. Otherwise, we're gonna wrap up here in a minute or two. Any questions from our?
I had a secondary question from one of our viewers about if you're doing last minute contributions, what's the most efficient way? If you're in Texas, probably the Texas House. The Senate, only half the seats are up, and shift of control is very unlikely because the districts that are up are pretty safely for one party or the other. But the House, everybody's up, and they're between 20 and 25 races, all of which are in, with one or two exceptions, are in Metro Houston, Metro Dallas-Fort Worth, and Austin, San Antonio. So there's some good House targets, particularly in these races where Republicans won by 5 or 6 points last time, but all those seats are at much greater risk this year. So you can just go online to the Secretary of State's website and look at the Republican performance in House districts 2 years ago. And any district that they were below 55%, those districts in these metro suburban areas are at great risk.
Yeah, so very competitive races there if folks want to contribute on either side. I agree. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm confident we will have little to talk about next week. Just that seems to be the norm. So I'm kidding, of course, but by next Friday we will have some early voting turnout. I think that we'll be able to discuss. I'll be interested to see how many votes we have in the can. I guess we'll have had 3 days of early voting completed by the time we meet next Friday, which I think should offer some interesting fodder for our conversation.
And I think when I looked yesterday, we had 138,000 absentee ballots returned. So we're already getting, some. Now we don't vote by party, so we don't have a breakdown of how many of those were returned by people who are registered as Democrats or Republicans. But we do have a pretty good reporting system in the Secretary of State's office that used to have the top 15 counties, but I think they've added everybody now. So every day or a few hours into the next day, you get the count of where things were the previous evening. And you can look back and look at the previous years. The apples to apples comparison is to compare 220 with 216 when it was the last presidential year. But yeah, that's a good site if you want to be a little bit of a political junkie. Office of Secretary of State, they'll have a link there to early voting. And I think now they're putting every county in the state up, which is good.
During the primary. Yeah.
Yeah. And used to we get the top 15 or top 20, but now they're all up. And, Republicans are hugely dependent upon that rural vote because that's where they run up their big margins and the medium-sized cities, the Lubbock's and the Amarillos. And of course, the Democrats have to have big turnout, not just in the core urban counties, but also now increasingly in the suburban counties.
Yeah. I did have one last question here asking about what kind of press or media coverage the Paxton matter is getting. Pretty substantial, I would say. The Austin American Statesman was the publication that broke the story last weekend. Subsequently, there have been multiple stories, both in the Houston Chronicle and the Dallas Morning News, Texas Tribune, and other outlets. I don't know that this is quite broken through to television yet. It's complex. And all the pieces haven't been overturned yet, which in my experience doesn't lend itself particularly well to TV yet. Till you get a perp walk or something, you don't get the good video that you want for a TV story. We'll see whether or not that happens, but there's been pretty very good and substantial print coverage from the major publications in the state, including here in Houston by Jay Root and Taylor Goldenstein at the Houston Chronicle, who both have sort of teamed up and done at least 3 or 4 quality articles. So I urge listeners, viewers to check those out, as well as the if you have access to the Tribune, the Austin American Statesman, and the Dallas Morning News. Lauren McGaughey there, who had written about Paxton's troubles, legal troubles several years ago, has now picked up the baton again and she's an investigative reporter with the Morning News and is digging back into this latest round of trouble for the Attorney General. So it's fascinating stuff for those of us who are kind of political junkies to watch. And I don't know where it's going to lead, but I've no doubt it'll be interesting. So,
and a couple of things, first, Paxton's current troubles have brought up this sort of 5-year dodge that he's been engaged in of not going to trial on previous charges. A big part of that was because a lot of the proceedings were going on in Collin County, his home county, where his wife is a state senator. Now he's in Travis County. It's a little bit different politically. Everybody in the courthouse there is a Democrat. And so he got a lot of cover out of Collin County.
Just ask Rick Perry about Ronnie Earl, right? The late former DA of Travis County.
So this is not likely to go away, particularly when you've got credible witnesses who were literally at your right hand that are running, saying there's something wrong here, and we want to get out in front of this story before we get engulfed in it.
Yeah. Well,
So,
we've got fascinating to watch over the coming days. But well, okay, Dad, thank you as always for joining us. Thank all of you for participating today, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.